Hello everyone, today we will be reviewing Chapter 1, Language and Thought. And so the first section goes over some basic definitions and terminology that go along with this chapter. And we'll talk about the basic structure of human language. And so to start out with, the human language is complex. It involves words representing intangible things and is used to think and conceptualize. So language allows individuals to exchange information, coordinate group action, and form strong social bonds. And so further, language distinguishes us from other species in three ways. So it is more complex than simple signaling. We can express a wider range of ideas and concepts than found in communications of other species and generate essentially infinite numbers of novel sentences. We can refer to intangible things such as a unicorn or democracy. And lastly, we can use language to name, categorize, and describe things when we think, which influences how information is organized in our brain. So our language is governed by grammar. So grammar is a set of rules that specify how the units of language can be combined together to produce meaningful messages. And so if we speak in a way that is not grammatically correct, then it's a rather inefficient way to speak. And it makes it harder for the listener to disentangle what we're trying to communicate and what we actually mean. And so consistent rules of grammar help people say what they mean and understand others more efficiently. And so compared with other forms of communication, human language is a relatively recent evolutionary phenomenon which has been traced as far back as 1 to 3 million years ago. And there are approximately 4,000 human languages, which linguists have grouped into 50 language families. Despite differences, all languages share a basic structure involving a set of sounds and rules for combining those sounds to produce some kind of meaning. And so if you've seen kids learning to read, they learn to read in phonemes, sounding out words one phoneme at a time. So often they do not recognize a word until they pronounce all of the phonemes out loud and fluidly. So interestingly, languages have different phonemes, and this limits the ability of the language speakers to discern non-meaningful differences. So interestingly, languages have different phonemes, and this limits the ability of the language speakers to discern non-meaningful differences. And so one example would be the P and B phonemes, and these when pronounced provide us subtle differences between the two. There's a distinction between these sounds in English, so children learning to speak English automatically acquire the ability to hear and produce these similar but distinct sounds. Some other languages, such as Hindi, do not differentiate between these sounds because there is only one phoneme for this sound. And so these individuals will have a more difficult time hearing and generating the distinction between these two phonemes. So the combination of phonemes is governed by phonological rules. And one example of these rules in English are the letters T and S. And typically we do not see words that begin with the letters T and S unless from another language, such as tsunami, but nevertheless it is usually pronounced as an S. And when we look at this, the TS sound is commonly actually begins words in German, but we can recognize languages simply based on this familiarity with their phonological rules. And so if the rules are different, resulting in speech sounds different from ours, we describe it as an accent. So our ability to automatically recognize whether a word is English versus German versus Spanish, these different types of phonological rules will help us in determining or being better able to differentiate between languages. And so the next thing that we'll talk about with phonemes, they're combined to make these morphemes. And our brain recognizes P at the beginning of pat as a speech sound, but it carries no particular meaning. So the P doesn't have any type of meaning carried with it. The morpheme pat, however, does carry meaning. So similarly, all languages have grammar rules that generally fall into two categories: rules of morphology and rules of syntax. So as such, some morphemes can stand alone as words like cat or dog. But with this, when we talk about content morphemes, these are items or descriptors like cat and leave, whereas function morphemes serve to provide conjunctions or indicate time, so when something happens. About half of our human language are morphemes, and morphemes also make the human language dramatically or grammatically complex enough to permit us to express abstract ideas to one another. Content and function morphemes can be combined and recombined to form an infinite number of new sentences, which are governed by syntax. And so here we talk about syntax in the next slide. And so morpheme rules help to create words, whereas syntax govern how words are combined to form phrases and sentences. And to generate a sentence, whether we are aware or unaware of this task, our brain starts out with the deep structure or meaning of a sentence and immediately lead to how are we going to word that sentence in order to convey the meaning that we want. And so after the deep structure is understood, the meaning of what we're trying to get across to the other person, we essentially discard the surface structure. So an example of this is if I asked someone to tell me what I just said, you'd be able to repeat the information, which is a reflection of the deep structure. So you get the meaning of what I'm trying to tell you, but you probably won't repeat it in the same exact words I used. So another example would be if I said the student answered the question and you said the question was answered by the student. These two phrases have the same deep structure but different surface structures. So they have the same meaning, but they're said in a different way. So here are the units of language laid out in a hierarchical figure. So the sentence, the boy hit the ball, can be broken down into the subject phrase, the boy, and then the predicate phrase, hit the ball. Further, these phrases can be broken down into morphemes, which are the individual words in the sentences. And finally, after that, we can break the morphemes down into phonemes, the individual sounds that compose those words. Now, grammar consists of two major parts: syntactical rules and morphological rules, as I mentioned earlier. So syntax has to do with the sentence structure and morphology has to do with word structure. So the rules of syntax regulate the way in which words can be combined to produce some type of meaning in a sentence or a phrase. So for example, one syntax rule is you must have a noun and a verb in every sentence. Another is you must have an object for every preposition. And this illustration that we see on the slide provides an example of those syntactical rules. So when we think about these complex rules that we use in our daily conversations, how do we actually learn to use them? And so this leads our discussion to turn towards language development in childhood. And so here we see three characteristics of language development, including the fact that children rapidly learn words at an astonishing rate. On average, when children are 1, they know about 10 words, like mommy and daddy. Fast forwarding to 4 years, they have mastered and used around 10,000 words. And interestingly, considering how many different ways a child can mess the sentence up with all of these syntactical and morphological rules, children are amazing at learning rules of language. And so it's been found that children make few errors while speaking or while learning to speak. And so we'll get into more of some of the errors that children do make when developing their language in a later slide. So the third characteristic involves children learning language by passive mastery. And so at a young age, children are not sitting in class learning these rules or actively learning new words. So if they're between the ages of 1 and 4, so before they go to pre-K or go on to kindergarten, these children are learning words primarily from their parents, brothers and sisters, and from their parents reading to them. They learn through listening and being exposed to language in the home. And research has demonstrated that passive mastery develops faster than active mastery. So in other words, they understand language better than they can speak it. So at birth, infants can distinguish between all human phonemes, although this ability does dissipate by 6 months of age. During this time of age, 6 months of age, they can distinguish among the contrasting sounds in the language they hear being spoken around them. And so one example where they may have difficulty distinguishing between two phonemes include the letters L and R, as in lead and red. And so they both have distinct sounds in English, but one example where they do not have distinct sounds is in the Japanese language, where L and R have the same phoneme. So they may have difficulty contrasting and differentiating between the two phonemes. So in addition to this, all infants go through the same Babbling sequence. And between 4 to 6 months, infants will often start with words which begin with the letters D and T before moving on to words that begin with M and N. So it may be easier for infants to say daddy as opposed to mommy. So even babies who are born deaf babble sounds they've never heard before in the same order as babies that have no hearing problems. And so interestingly, this provides evidence that babies aren't just imitating and that babbling is a natural part of development. So in order for babbling and language development to continue, however, babies must hear themselves. And so if they are having hearing problems such as chronic ear infections or start to develop deafness in their ears, these can lead to speech impairments, but do not necessarily prevent them from learning language. So infants who are born deaf and whose parents communicate with them using American Sign Language, for example, actually begin to babble with the use of their hands at the same age as children with typical hearing. And so I just find that very, very interesting. When we talk about milestones, this is similar to talking about what we would expect to find in children that are typically developing. Some developmental milestones include distinguishing all contrasting sounds in human language beginning at birth, which we've already mentioned before. They begin to babble speech sounds between the ages of 4 to 6 months. They are only able to distinguish those sounds in language being spoken around them at around 6 months, and they learn their first words at 10 months to 1 year. And the process, continuing on, of fast mapping enables children to learn at a rapid pace, which is in contrast to effort required to learn academic skills such as arithmetic and writing. And significantly, at 2 years, children begin to form two-word sentences like more milk or throw a ball, and this is referred to as telegraphic speech. So telegraphic speech consists mostly of content words. Despite the absence of function words like prepositions and articles, these two-word sentences tend to be grammatically correct. And so they are ordered in a manner consistent with the syntactical rules of the language the children are learning to speak. And so they may say throw ball instead of ball throw, and this indicates they've already acquired an appreciation of the syntactical rules of the language that they're learning. And so why is it that 2- and 3-year-olds use correct grammar like I ran, you ate, yet 4- and 5-year-olds will form incorrect sentences like I runned and you eated? This is probably due to very young children memorizing particular sounds that express what they want to communicate. As children acquire grammatical rules, they tend to overgeneralize. So the ed indicates past tense, so run becomes runded or randed. And this demonstrates that language acquisition is not simply a matter of imitating adult speech. Instead, they acquire grammatical rules by listening to the speech of those around them and use the rules to create verbal forms they've never heard before, because it's unlikely that they hear their parents say runded or randed or eated. The child is applying rules to create new non-words. By 3 years, children are able to complete simple sentences that include function words, so give me the ball, that belongs to me. And between 4 and 5 years, many aspects of language acquisition is complete. So they can appreciate humor, sarcasm, irony, and by the time a child begins school, they have a vocab of around 10,000 words, and by the 5th grade, the average child knows the meaning of 40,000 words, and by college, you will have learned over 200,000 words. Lastly, this chart will be useful for you guys to study with, and it's basically a summary of the information that is presented in the chapter on language development. And so that wraps up the first part of chapter 9.